Thank you. Mr. Jackson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rogers, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. NATO is a partnership which is vital to deterring aggression and responding when dictators and terrorists bring evil to this world. I just returned from the Munich Security Conference, and it's clear to me that our allies do not see us as the leaders that we have traditionally been. The weapons and resources that we are providing are important, but we need to strengthen these partnerships and continue to invest properly in critical NATO training, like the Euro-NATO Joint Jet Pilot Training Program, which is hosted in my district at Shepherd Air Force Base. In 2017, President Trump took action to restore NATO to being the global force for good that it once was. He forced delinquent members to start paying their dues, ultimately accounting to hundreds of billions of dollars and helping NATO prepare for aggression like we are currently seeing from Russia. Ukraine's defense of its sovereign territory has been admirable and inspiring, yet many don't realize that it was the Trump administration that helped Ukraine to prepare for this. Under President Trump, security assistance and defense articles were sent to Ukraine to give them the capability to defend themselves, and that is exactly what they are doing as we speak. Prior to last year, our allies knew the United States had their back, but now I'm concerned that we are losing that trust and confidence of these same allies. When I was at the Munich Security Conference, we had some very candid conversations with many of our strongest allies, trying to reassure them that the United States would not leave them behind. Dr. Karlin and Mrs. Lewis, what have you been hearing from our allies and partners about whether or not they can trust the United States to be a leader on the global stage, and is there anything more that we can be doing to reassure our partners?
Thank you very much, Congressman, and thank you for your focus on this issue. I really appreciate your initial comments about speaking with our allies. I think we have spent a lot of time with our allies. In fact, I noted earlier that particularly over the last 3 months, as we have seen this intelligence, I don't think a day's gone by where there hasn't been an ally or partner discussion on this topic with the Department of Defense or the Department of State. And I think we've seen that come to fruition. We have seen allied unity, which seems pretty almost unprecedented, if not actually unprecedented. And we've also seen allies giving a lot of support to Ukraine and to one another. So it seems to me that we are at a special moment for the alliance and a special moment for leadership. And I think we want to do all we can to encourage that, because at the end of the day, we're just so much more effective when we can be together. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I fully support Dr. Karlin's comments, and I really appreciate what you raised in terms of NATO and the importance of NATO at this critical moment. I think, from my perspective as the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, on a daily basis, minute-to-minute basis, often overnight, we are literally working with our partners to make sure that the vital equipment and defense items that Ukraine needs, that it is getting those items. I have to tell you, certainly in my time here, I have never seen NATO and Europeans come together. And as I said, we are one of the tools that we have in our toolbox is something called it sounds like a technical term, but it's very important. It's third-party transfers. What this means is if the United States has provided a system to another country and they want to transfer it to a third country, they have to ask first, which is a good thing. But in this case, we have been literally flooded with the Europeans coming to us and saying, we have this, we know the Ukrainians need it, can you move quickly to make that happen?
Thank you, Mrs. Lewis. I'm going to close you because I got one more thing I want to throw in there. It's a little bit of a plug for my district, to be honest with you, but the Euro-NATO Joint Jet Pilot Training Program is in my district in the world's only internationally manned and managed pilot training program. 50% of all U.S. Air Force pilots come from this program, and partner nations such as Belgium, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and Norway send all of their fighter pilots through this training program in Wichita Falls. We need to make sure, it's really important that we're given the resources and the weapons that we need, but we need to make sure that we are investing and prioritizing NATO training as well, and specifically these NATO pilots that we're training for potential war with Russia or China. It would be a mistake, I think, not to take opportunity to try to prioritize some of this training as well. Dr. Karlin, what is the value of the Euro-NATO Joint Jet Pilot Training Program to the Department of Defense, and in what ways does DoD seek to expand and build on this program moving forward?
Thank you very much, Congressman. While I can't speak to this specific program, what I can tell you is you're hitting all of the key issues that are vital to NATO. How are we training one another? How are we working on interoperability so that we can do exercises together? And so, God forbid, if we have to deal with a contingency, we can do so together.
Thank you. I believe my time is up. I yield back. Thank you both.
Thank you. Mr. Khan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this hearing, and thank you for your leadership in Munich and working with the Speaker and the administration to rally our NATO allies in a strong response to Putin's invasion, unconscionable aggression, and now reports of war crimes. I wanted to focus on the Wagner Group, which has laid, according to some reports, the groundwork for Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine. It's a brutal group, as many of you know, and has been identified by the Treasury Department as a designated Russian Ministry of Defense proxy force. There's been reports that it's done Russia's bidding in Syria, Libya, and parts of Africa. I'd like to hear from both of the witnesses on what the Pentagon and the State Department know about the logistics chains that support the Wagner Group. Are they involved at all right now in Ukraine? And what is being done about addressing the Wagner Group?
Thank you very much, Congressman, for bringing up this important issue. I think we have seen efforts by the Wagner Group in various places, and they have been profoundly worrisome. I think you put it quite well in your opening statement in terms of their relationships and their focus. In this forum, I don't believe I can speak about some of the operational efforts that they have undertaken, but I'd be more than willing to do so separately. Suffice to say, I think it is safe to say that they do not have the security and stability of various regions as their top priority.
If I may add, and I'm very glad that we're getting to have a conversation about the Wagner Group here in this forum, and I think when we look at what they have done across the globe, and I end up very concerned, particularly in Africa, as they really are exploiting insecurity as a catalyst, and they are using that destabilization in very, very dangerous ways. I believe that the Russian government considers chaos as a strategic asset, and it raises the costs of the involvement for strategic competitors. So I think you are right to be focused on this topic. We continue to be focused on it around the world, and happy to continue the conversation with you, as Dr. Karlin said, on more specifics in another setting.
I appreciate that. Are any of our allies supporting the Wagner Group that we know of, or are we making every effort to make sure that anyone we're allied with or selling weapons to or is not in any way aiding the Wagner Group?
Congressman, I can't say offhand that any are coming to mind, but we can take that back and look into it. I think on the whole, most of our allies and partners have seen this group for what it is.
Okay. If you could just make sure that maybe I don't want to throw out any names and reporting with it and cast an aspersion that may not be true, but there's been some reports that some of our partners may be supporting some of these groups, and if you could just make sure that the United States should make clear, obviously anyone we're shipping arms to should not in any way be linked to the Wagner Group, and I assume that's U.S. policy. Is that correct?
Congressman, we could absolutely take that back and get you a response, a written response on that one. As I said, I'm not familiar with any allies. We can look at partners as well. And if we are seeing it, frankly, then we'll want to highlight it to them, since we do not see this as a group that foments stability or security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate both witnesses, and I just would reiterate my concern on this group's activity, their blatant violation of human rights, and say that I am very supportive of the Department of State and Department of Defense doing anything possible to stop them and to make sure that they're not getting funding or arms. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Banks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Karlin, Germany's reliance on Nord Stream 2 hindered their response to support Ukraine. It took a military invasion, a threat of a nuclear attack, and persistent calls from allies for Germany to support Ukraine with 1,000 anti-tank weapons and 500 surface-to-air missiles. Dr. Karlin, why was Germany hesitant to defend a sovereign nation from invasion that's just 400 miles away from their own border?
Thank you very much, Congressman. While I can't speak to the thinking in Berlin, what I can say is that we have seen an extraordinary change by Germany's government in recent days. They, as you probably know, had a law that they wouldn't support countries in active conflict. That has completely changed. We have been pushing them for a very long time to invest more in their military. That is completely changing. Indeed, the trajectory that Germany is currently on, given these recent events, is extraordinary. And I think it will have outsized effects for European security. Thank you.
Thank you. Should the U.S. change our military-to-military relationship with Germany after they hesitated to act against Russian aggression, or if we see a pattern of this in the future?
Congressman, I think we would want to take a broader look at our relationship. Germany, for example, also hosts tens of thousands of U.S. troops and plays an important role in European security in other ways. I think particularly given the steps that we have seen, this is a crucial relationship. It's crucial not just for European security, frankly, but for global security. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lewis, the UK, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, the Czech Republic, the Netherlands, Belgium, they all committed weapons and equipment to Ukraine before Germany did. Why do you think Germany waited so long to send weapons to Ukraine?
Again, first of all, thank you for the question. And as Dr. Karlin said, I can't speak to the exact mindset there. But I do want to take a moment to note what you mentioned here, which is the extraordinary effort we have seen across Europe and now obviously including Germany. I think, as I mentioned before, the part of the State Department I work in, we oversee those transfers from of U.S. origin equipment from one country to another. And I think across the board, this has been an extraordinary effort, and we're happy to continue to work with all of the countries who are close by and able to provide Ukraine with what it needs.
So no thoughts or no discussions at the State Department about why Germany followed instead of leading the rest of these countries?
I'm not aware of any discussions.
Okay. Ms. Lewis, Germany is Russia's largest trading partner in Europe. 6,000 German companies do business in Russia. Is it time for us to rethink our alliance to ensure that our allies share our national security goals? For instance, should we consider an alliance of democracies that share a strong desire to counter Russia and China?
Well, I think that across the board, we do have partners and allies and friends and alliances where we are working together to counter Russia. To take a step back out of the space that I work in particularly, which is related to security assistance, we have seen Europe coming together really in an unprecedented way with sanctions, looking at, as I just discussed, arms transfers, condemnation of Russia's actions. And I think we need to continue to work with all of them to make sure that we move forward hand in glove. I think us being united is really what, in some ways, Russia fears most. And I think that is the message that we need to carry forward.
All right, thank you. Dr. Karlin, at a Center for New American Security Forum last December, you said, quote, "Our thinking on deterrence has declined a bit," end quote, since the 1990s after the Soviet Union disintegrated, you were referring to. In light of the conflict with Ukraine, I'm concerned that the Biden administration isn't taking deterrence seriously enough. How are we supporting and improving Taiwan's military to ensure that they are not the next target for an invasion?
Thank you very much, Congressman. I would just say post-Cold War and post-9/11, I do think we didn't focus on deterrence as much. Secretary Austin's emphasis on integrated deterrence, I think, is pushing us in a slightly different place. And I think Taiwan is a perfect example, as you note. We are cooperating very closely in line with the Taiwan Relations Act to help Taiwan build its military with defensive capabilities, and in particular to do so with the asymmetric capabilities they need to counter what is unfortunately an ever-growing threat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Jacobs is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I want to note that a couple of my colleagues have raised the issue of respecting human rights in our security assistance and making sure that it aligns with our values, including you, Mr. Chair. And I wanted to follow up on a couple specific programs. In particular, I'm concerned that there are certain security cooperation authorities that are not subject to Leahy vetting, like Section 127 ECHO and 1202 programs. So Assistant Secretary Karlin, could you clarify whether either of these programs are currently subject to Leahy vetting?
Thank you very much for raising this, Congresswoman. We absolutely prioritize Leahy vetting. My understanding is that ensuring that our partners are following human rights is a key priority in everything that we do. So while I cannot speak at this moment as to whether or not Leahy vetting exactly applies, I can promise you that we are looking at how and in what ways our partners and allies are appropriately following human rights. And if they're violating them, then that means we need to have a relook and have a different kind of conversation. And if there are any specifics that you'd like me to take back, I'm more than willing to do so either now or, of course, separately.
Perfect. Well, I will look forward to working with you to get in writing some more clarification on that question of Leahy vetting and those two programs and how we're making sure we're not providing security assistance to units that are committing gross human rights violations. I want to turn now to the Sahel. We have seen a proliferation of coups over the past year, almost all of which have involved militaries that have been trained by the United States, including Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso. How has the development impacted state and DoD's thinking on who we provide security assistance to? Many of these countries had issues with human rights violations in the past, particularly in Burkina Faso and Mali, and lacked robust security sector governance and democratic progress that made this kind of challenge predictable. In fact, when I worked at the State Department 5 or so years ago, we were working on security sector governance in some of these countries because we knew it was a problem. So what signals are we sending about our values when we provide security assistance despite these challenges? And what does this say about our stabilization and good governance efforts in the region more broadly? What tools are underutilized to better address these challenges? And how do we make sure moving forward our security assistance is leading towards what we want, which is secure and democratically governed and human rights abiding governments?
Well, thank you for the question. And I am very committed, and I think it's important that you raise this question of security sector governance. And I think you're right that as we work with countries, we need to make sure that we're looking at this across the board, whether it comes to human rights, whether it comes to making sure that, and I keep coming back to this, but I think it's important that procurement systems are set up in ways that keep corruption from happening. And so I think across the board, we need to do that. In every country we're working in. I think you raise legitimate concerns about what's going on in Africa. We are watching that very, very closely, and we always want to be promoting democracy and making sure that any training that happens in our programs supports that effort. And I would be happy to continue to work with you as we continue to look at these questions.
Thank you very much for raising this really important issue. I think the end state you outlined of our goals of this security cooperation is exactly right: secure, democratically governed. I wholly align myself with Assistant Secretary Lewis's comments, and I would say the examples you cited are profoundly worrisome, and when we see those occur, we do need to immediately step back and study why that did occur. Oftentimes, of course, it's due to kind of much bigger political reasons within a country, but ultimately that doesn't really provide a country with more security or stability. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I will look forward to working with you both on making sure that we are having a coherent, cohesive strategy on our security sector programs, especially in Africa, to make sure that we're not perpetuating and feeding into these challenges and adverse incentive structures for these governments that we're partnering with. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for testifying today. In the past weeks, we've seen the vital role alliances play in effectively countering and responding to the destabilizing actions of rogue states like Russia. We've also seen the extraordinary value of long-term capacity building with our partners through the deployment of advisors and regular multilateral training events. The training U.S. advisors have provided to our Ukrainian allies over the past years have made them a far more lethal fighting force and added unique capabilities to their armed forces, such as the effective employment of Javelin missiles. I believe these types of training missions and military-to-military partnerships are foundational to strong and resilient alliances and are also one of the most cost-effective mission sets conducted by the Department of Defense. As the department continues to address the pacing threat of China in the Indo-Pacific, I hope that these exercises and missions will receive the attention and funding they deserve. U.S. Army Pacific is well positioned to build and maintain strong relationships with strategically vital nations in the Indo-Pacific through exercises like Pacific Pathways. These exercises are mutually beneficial. They benefit the host nation militarily, economically, and diplomatically, and also allow the United States and allied nations to place combat power forward to deter aggression. Secretary Karlin, how do exercises like Pacific Pathways allow the joint force to build capacity and trust with partners in the Indo-Pacific, counter China's influence, and pre-position forces to deter Chinese aggression against Taiwan?
Thank you very much, Congressman. And I just want to say how much I appreciate your emphasis on training and exercises. I think oftentimes when we speak about security cooperation, folks focus on the materiel piece. But as you absolutely note, the training is crucial to ensure they know how to use the materiel, but also the exercises. And those are really helpful for a couple reasons. First of all, they're really good for our forces. They help our forces test things out. Second of all, they're useful for interoperability, helping us figure out with our allies and partners who does what, how do we do that? And third of all, I would emphasize they're pretty useful for deterrence and reassurance. You highlighted China. I think it is quite clear that China is watching these exercises. They watch when they grow in sophistication, and in particular, they watch when our allies and partners grow ever more capable. Thank you.
So how would increased funding for these exercises contribute to U.S. strategic objectives in the Indo-Pacific?
Thank you very much. Looking at resources, of course, it would really matter how they get best distributed. I could imagine that certain exercises could be made larger, or other countries could perhaps be invited into them, or they might be longer. I'd probably want to look at kind of how and in what ways those are used. But as you underscore, exercises are really critical both to our partners' capacity and also to our own. Thank you.
Thank you. With the reduction of forces in Central Command following the end of our mission in Afghanistan, I'm curious if regionally aligned forces like the 3rd Security Force Assistance Brigade could be better applied to U.S. strategic objectives in the Indo-Pacific. Again, Secretary Karlin, as part of the Global Posture Review, how has the department reprioritized these specialized partner-building forces to increase capacity in the Indo-Pacific?
Thank you very much, Congressman. These Security Force Assistance Brigades are pretty new. They were only started a couple years ago, and I think we've seen them really have an outsized effect in various regions. I think particularly going forward, we need to think about where they're best placed and how they can best rotate. But I would say offhand, we've seen them in Africa play a helpful role. I have to assume that as you cite, the Indo-Pacific is one as well. So it's really a matter of looking at kind of all the tools in our toolkits. But these SFABs, they have been a really positive innovation by the U.S. Army. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Panetta is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you both to the witnesses for being here, obviously talking about the important topics of our allies, but also the way we work with our allies in order to deal with the situations at hand, be it in Ukraine or be it with China. I want to hit on my California colleagues' questions on the Wagner Group. I think that's very fascinating, to be honest with you, especially what's going on in Mali, and the fact that it was Mali where they had Operation Barkhane and the French were in there, as well as 15,000 blue helmets of the United Nations were there as well. Unfortunately, the French has decided to leave based on the fact that Mali has decided to, I guess, contract with the Wagner Group for certain security purposes. I set that up with that, basically talking about hybrid warfare and how we are working with our allies in dealing with hybrid warfare, basically before we have to send troops in. And so if you could just give us an overview of the resources that we are doing in working with our allies to counter hybrid warfare, but also the challenges. Do our allies have some of the technology, some of the capacity to deal with those types of challenges that we're dealing with when it comes to hybrid warfare?
Thank you very much, Congressman. I share your profound concerns about the Wagner Group. And as the French are relooking their role across the Sahel, we're really working closely with them to understand how and in what ways we're understanding the terrorist threat there. I'm really happy that you brought up hybrid or gray zone warfare. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of examples of it over the last few years. And in terms of allied cooperation, I think the most important piece is, frankly, how we counter disinformation. That's important because it sort of has the first level impact of how we understand the threat and how they understand the threat. You know, what we have seen, I think, masterfully over these last few months is that Russia has really not been able to flood the system with effective disinformation, because each time they try to do so, we and our allies are immediately pushing information about here's what's happening, here's who's doing it. When we can have that common threat picture, it just makes it a lot easier for us to then deal with these hybrid challenges.
So basically countering it with the truth is what you're saying?
1,000%, and countering it early and countering it often, so that, as we saw, I think, in 2014, the Russians managed to shape the narrative and seep in a lot of doubt about what was going on. That made it hard for the U.S. response. It made it hard for our allied response. And I think part of what we see is so different with 2022's tragedy in Ukraine compared to 2014 is that there is zero doubt about what happened and who is to blame for what happened. And I think that's helped result in just this unprecedented effort of allied unity and response.
Next level beyond disinformation, what would it be?
Beyond disinformation, I think another way of dealing with gray zone or hybrid conflict is really showing how our militaries can cooperate, and in particular, actually, per the earlier question, in terms of exercises. So gray zone is an attempt to kind of hit just below the threshold to test us out, or to test our allies and partners out. And to the extent our competitors say through our exercises, that those efforts aren't actually going to work, that they are not going to achieve their objectives, then they're going to be a whole lot less likely to try them.
Great, great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you. Mr. I can stretch this out. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Karlin, I wanted to just kind of start by asking you, how do you think we're doing when it comes to allies and partners? You know, what kind of grade do you give ourselves now? Just trying to get a sense of your baseline, because I was looking through your testimony, thinking through what it is we can improve. But I'm just curious where you think we're starting from right now.
Thank you very much, Congressman Kim. I'm a little bit of a hard grader, so I would probably give us a B+ or so. In particular, I think we've made a lot of important changes in how we do security cooperation. A lot of that is tied, frankly, to Congress, to the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, which forced us to cooperate a whole lot deeper, Department of State, Department of Defense. It really streamlined a patchwork of authorities, and above all, it really pushed us to do meaningful assessment monitoring and evaluation. So we don't just focus on inputs and outputs, but are we meeting our operational and strategic objectives? So I think we are on a very positive trajectory compared to where I might say we are 5, 10, 15 years ago. Thank you.
Now, you know, you rightfully pointed out that obviously two of the biggest challenges that we face going forward, one China, one Russia. Right now, we're obviously faced with this global challenge when it comes to Russia. We've seen NATO and our European partners really step up in big ways, but I'm curious how you would assess our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. What has been their response to what we've seen with Russia?
Thank you very much, Congressman. And Assistant Secretary Lewis may wish to add to this. In particular, I would say our Indo-Pacific allies and partners and China are watching this very, very closely. They're watching the steps that we take, and they're also watching just the extraordinary, unprecedented steps that a lot of our European allies are taking. What I have seen in particular among our Asian allies and partners is a real focus on the economic piece and how they can be helpful on that front vis-a-vis the Russia conflict. Thank you.
And really, I just would add that I agree with Dr. Karlin. I do think as we look at our partners in Asia and allies and partners and friends, that they have seen the united front against Russian aggression. I think that sends a very clear message. I think that what we are consistently hearing is that they are strongly in support of what NATO, Europe, and the United States are doing.
Would you say that the response by our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific has been equivalent to what we've seen from our European partners?
I don't want to sort of measure one or the other. I think our European partners are literally physically closer, and so are able to respond in real time and in the ways that folks who are a little further away.
Many of our Indo-Pacific partners are very close to Russia as well.
That's true. They're closer. I am thinking more specifically in terms of the role that I play, which is that we work on these third-party transfers where we're able to help make sure that equipment, U.S. origin equipment that's inside other countries in Europe is able to be transferred to Ukraine.
The reason I just kind of mentioned this is that I'm trying to get a sense of how things would play out. You know, if we were to see a crisis emerge much more squarely within the Indo-Pacific, I think we've seen NATO, who's an organization that's been tested, an organization that's had its mission changed a couple times. But obviously, we have a much more kind of diffuse situation in the Indo-Pacific in terms of different types of structures that are there. So I guess my question to you is if we were to see something much more squarely in the Indo-Pacific, whether that's about China in the future, how confident are you that we would see our partners there step up? And to the level that we might be seeing with the Europeans right now. I'm just kind of curious what your assessment of that level of health is of that partnership.
Thank you very, very much for that. I think what we have seen is a strengthening of our allies and partners across the Indo-Pacific in recent years, and also with our Europeans. So just two examples I'd quickly offer are AUKUS and then the Indo-Pacific Quad. I think as China has engaged in increasingly problematic behavior, they're all growing closer together and growing increasingly worried. So I think we're on a very positive trajectory to recognize and then to deal with this growing challenge. I will at least be very curious to watch how, as this conflict further unfolds in Europe, our Indo-Pacific allies and partners, what lessons are they taking from it? I think Assistant Secretary Lewis is spot on when she said they see the power of unity and how effective it is. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Congresswoman Chrissy Houlihan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate you guys hanging in there. I've been out and in, and you've had to be there the entire time. I have so many questions that I actually don't know where to start. One of my questions has to do with Article 5, and it has to do with cyber incursions. And what defines a triggering mechanism in terms of cyber incursions, assuming attribution, where we would assume that we were defending NATO allies, either ourselves or otherwise. I'm watching the news go by, and I'm seeing that there's all kinds of shenanigans going on in the cyberspace, some of them coming from industry, to be honest. And what I worry, because I understand that we've pretty emphatically said there will be no boots on the ground and there will be no American response, but I do feel as though we're in a different world now with cyber issues and want to understand if there's been a great deal of thought put to what that would look like, what would be the triggering mechanism for that.
Thank you very much for raising this. And I would just broadly say NATO has made great strides in thinking about the cyber domain and thinking about how and in what ways escalation differs in that domain and how it can play off of others. And I think it was just under a year or so ago that NATO effectively said, we've got to think about cyber the way we are thinking about those other domains. So I can assure you that is a very hot topic of conversation. And I think, unfortunately, we're getting some case studies to test out what that will really look like. But at a minimum, what is really nice compared to 5-10 years ago is there's some profound focus here on it and a desire by a lot of our NATO allies to invest in cyber capabilities, cyber resilience. Assistant Secretary Lewis may want to add to that a little bit.
No, look, I agree 100% with what Dr. Karlin said, and I do appreciate you raising the issue because this is one that may, unfortunately, may be before us shortly. I do think there have been a lot of discussions about what is the best way to evaluate this moving forward. I also think that as the Department of Defense continues to focus on hybrid warfare, it's not only a relevant question related to NATO and Article 5, but really as we look across the world and for ourselves as well. I have been pleased so far that we have been able to come up with good answers with our allies and partners, but we're going to continue to need to work on those definitions and responses.
Yeah, and I think that what worries me is that we don't have a plan. I will know it when we see it. It's going to become sort of a case study in action, as near as I can tell, when we have to make decisions, I think, on the fly about what merits some sort of a threat to us or to our allies, and that concerns me. This activation of the NATO response force is kind of related in the sense that it's a profound, pivotal moment in our history. And speaking about case studies, is there a plan to make sure that we're documenting and capturing the lessons that we're learning from this activation and possible employment of this response? And are we making sure that we can learn lessons, historic lessons from what's happening right now?
Thank you very much for raising this point. NATO is actually in the throes of building its strategic concept for future contingencies. And as they are doing that, which happens on a quite rare basis, they're absolutely going to look at what's occurring now, the activation, as you noted, which is just incredibly important, and trying to understand what effect has that had, what's gone well, what do we need to improve on for the future. Thank you.
My other questions have to do with Indo-PACOM and China. And I was hoping to ask if you feel as though with all of the movement that's going on in the European theater, if you're at all worried about readiness in Indo-PACOM.
Thank you very much. As you know, we can't just keep our eye on one theater, and so we're not. In fact, the Navy just did a freedom of navigation operation quite recently in the Indo-Pacific in the last few days or so. So we are absolutely trying to ensure that the kind of geopolitical challenge that we see China has continued to have is one that we are focusing on, while also very much accounting for the profound sea change, I think, challenge that we're seeing from Russia.
Ms. Lewis?
Yeah, agree. And I think one of the real challenges we have is dealing with Russia, but at the same time, keeping our eye on what's going on with China. I know we've had a robust discussion of Taiwan, but just emphasizing that once again, you know, under the guidance of the Taiwan Relations Act, we are making sure that they're prepared as well, and have focused on security assistance to them that makes them prepared from an asymmetric perspective.
I think I've run out of time. I appreciate that, and I yield back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for self-regulating your time there. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chair. Dr. Karlin, I know that Section 333 of Title 10 it provides primary authority to the department to train and equip partners to build the capacity of military forces in 9 specific areas. And I serve on the subcommittee that oversees Special Ops Command. And as you may know, one of SOCOM's core activities is the military information support operations. Can you help me understand if MISO is covered under one of these 9 areas? And if so, how are we using Section 333 to build partner capacity in MISO?
Thank you very much for raising this issue. I cannot right now speak to MISO being included in this, but I pledge to come back to you as soon as possible in writing on that exact issue. I would just say writ large, the way in which we engage in MISO has to be responsible, not least to ensure that it is effective.
And I think I would really appreciate the response on that. I think the SOCOM and the Special Ops community has been using MISO to some great effect and really some interesting innovations, and especially as we look at how information is a key part of how our adversaries engage in conflict. It will be important for us to better build this capacity and have partners and allies who also have the ability to conduct MISO. Ms. Lewis, I'm a member of Congress from Florida, and so I'm particularly interested in security cooperation with countries in the Western Hemisphere. Can you tell me a bit more about our security cooperation activities in Latin America and the Caribbean? Which partner nation forces are we training and equipping? And more broadly, how would you judge the efficacy of our efforts in building capacity in this AOR?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I had a real focus on Latin America early in my career, and so I'm always happy to get to discuss it again in this format. I think we have provided security assistance to the region over many years. I think most recently, we have focused very much on Colombia. I'm sure you've been aware of really the transformation that happened in Colombia, to a great extent, obviously, real tribute to the Colombians themselves, who were dealing with an incredibly difficult insurgency in their own country, drug war at the same time. And so I think that is always at top of mind in terms of continuing our support for them moving forward. And then throughout the rest of the region, we have a whole range of programs. There are some countries where, due to the situation with their current government, we're not able to work with them anymore. But we look to build and strengthen that partnership throughout the region, and happy to continue working with you and your staff as you focus on this from your perspective in Florida.
And do you think that our partnership capacity building and our presence in the region has had an impact on our ability to position for great power competition in the region?
I'm actually very glad you raised this. I was lucky enough to just get me with our Southcom commander, who's extraordinary, and she's very focused on this question. I think that we often, when we think specifically about China, we often think about, the Indo-Pacific, and sometimes we think about Africa, but I think it's very important that we need to look at what's happening there as well. My view is it's not just a question of security cooperation or security assistance or how we're postured, but it is also the relationships that we need to develop in that region. I think as we've talked about, China often uses small investments to get big leverage. My view is that they often do that in ways that really actually are detrimental to the countries that they're purporting to assist or help. And so I think this needs to be a renewed area of focus in the Western Hemisphere as we move forward. And I know that across the interagency, we are committed to doing that.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I'll yield back, and I'll note that I'm one-upping Ms. Houlihan by yielding back 30 seconds.
Thank you. We appreciate it greatly. I'm told not to get too comfortable in this chair, so we'll keep this going. I'm going to turn it over to Congresswoman Spear. Over to you for 5 minutes. Congresswoman Spear, can you hear us?
I can't. Let me just see.
We can hear you now.
You can hear me? Okay, great. Thank you both for your outstanding presentations this morning. I'd like to ask Dr. Karlin a question. First of all, let me say how impressed I am with your credentials, with your time you've spent in 5 different administrations in defense work. So your work is really quite valuable. I'm concerned about the security cooperation agreements that we have, because on the one hand, it is intended to convey our values, our priorities, and our foreign policy objectives to both allies and adversaries. Between 2018 and 2020, the country of Azerbaijan received $120 million in Section 333 partner capacity building funds, despite its authoritarian government and armed aggression towards its democratic neighbor, Armenia. In contrast, Armenia received $0 during that same period. So, Secretary Karlin, you testify that the department seeks to, quote, cultivate security partners who can appropriately and effectively be regional security anchors, especially during crisis. Given the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, in which Azerbaijan initiated it, and it cost thousands of lives and hundreds of thousands of people being displaced. I mean, I don't think anyone could argue that Azerbaijan has lived up to that ideal. So has that war in 2020 caused the department to reevaluate whether Azerbaijan is a worthy partner of the U.S., and if not, why?
Thank you very much for your opening remarks and for your kind words. I'll offer some thoughts, and Assistant Secretary Lewis may wish to add a bit as well on this one. But in particular, that comment site is it was indeed a horrific one, and it is one that we've looked closely at. I would say not only given what our partners have been involved with, but also because of how that conflict played out. And in particular, it's a real case study in drone warfare. When we have these security cooperation relationships, it is really important that we closely monitor how and in what ways such assistance is being used, and that we have very frank conversations with our partners if we think that that is not being used in appropriate or effective ways. Let me turn to Assistant Secretary Lewis, who I think may want to add a bit on this one. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Dr. Karlin, and thank you for the question. I'd certainly echo the comments that she made. When it comes to the State Department side of the House, we don't actually provide foreign military financing to either country, but we are providing assistance on conventional weapons destruction, which we do so equally. As you may be aware, that's because that program is specifically designed to prevent civilians from being killed or injured by conventional weapons, and so that is the program we have continued.
Well, I guess I'm still not following whether or not there's been any repercussions to Azerbaijan as a result of their aggression to Armenia. They used Turkey and their drones to create havoc and injury and killings in the region. And I guess I'm not hearing from you that there's been any penalty for that.
I think, first of all, I very much appreciate the concerns that you're raising about what happened during that conflict. And I think the State Department has been following those very closely. I think in terms of the specific programs that we work on here, we aren't providing any foreign military financing, any foreign military financing to Azerbaijan. And so in this case, the only program that we have continuing there is the one for conventional weapons destruction.
So, Dr. Karlin, what kind of repercussions have they endured as a result of their actions since they've received $120 million from the U.S. government?
Thank you very much for highlighting this, Congresswoman. If it would be possible, might I suggest that I submit to you a written statement with more detail on this specific one to ensure that we're really meeting the intent of your important question?
All right. I appreciate that. Thank you. I yield back.
Great. Thank you. Well, look, we're going to start to wrap up here. Before I do so, I ask unanimous consent that the statement of Representative Meeks be included in the record. Hearing none, it is so ordered. I just want to say thank you so very much for taking the time to talk with us. I know there's a lot going on right now that you all are responding to, but I think it was very helpful for us to be able to have this chance to be able to take a step back and look forward in terms of where we're trying to get towards, what objectives we're trying to achieve. I know you have other conversations up on the Hill that you need to get to, so I will let you go. We are so adjourned. Thank you, everyone.